When King John drove out the Mamelukes and came to our village, he found dreadful things. People bowed down to Satan and said their masses to him. They had become witches and were evil. Well, King John put some of them to the sword, but some, the wisest and the most wicked, escaped into the mountains.
Good evening, guys and ghouls, and welcome back to Monster Craze Memoirs, a generational podcast about B-movies. I am your host, Ian Garcia. Vladimir Ivanovich Hofschneider was born in 1904, a Russian Jew of ethnicity from a well-off family of Christian converts. His mother, Anna, left his father and emigrated with her two children to the United States, reverting to her maiden name, Lewton, an Americanization of Levinton. In kind, Vladimir was raised under the name Vladimir Ivan Lewton, although he would not legally change his name until being naturalized as a citizen in a federal court in Los Angeles in 1941. The family settled in New York, living in the home of Anna's sister, Alla Nazimova, a famous Broadway actress and eventual silent film star. From the early stages of his development, Vladimir, along with his sister Lucy Olga, was raised by fiercely independent women. Anna began a successful career as a writer for films, and eventually moved the family to the suburb of Port Chester. By 1928, she had become the head of MGM's story department. She later used these connections to boost Lewton's film career. Val's early interests were in journalism, holding various magazine and newspaper jobs since his teens before studying at Columbia University. He eventually transitioned into fiction writing. He settled in Riverside, Connecticut, and between 1923 and 1932, Lewton wrote one book of poetry and 5 novels. He also dabbled in pulp, sometimes writing under a pseudonym, one of his products being The Bagita, published in Weird Tales in July 1930, set in a medieval southern Russian village in the Caucasus Mountains, and concerning the hunt of a were-beast that can change between the form of a black panther and a beautiful, sensual woman who tempts good Christian men to sin. In his popular writing, Lewton also began his track record of being marginalized into racy, pulpy genres, where he nonetheless demonstrated a capacity for uncompromising, melancholic attention to quality and detail, as well as an ability to work under tight deadlines and minimal resources. The most successful of which during this period was No Bed of Her Own, which was serialized in The Mirror and eventually loosely adapted into the film No Man of Her Own in the same year. No Bed of Her Own is the story of an independent young secretary named Rose, whose insolence towards her middle managers gets her sacked just as the stock market crashes. Recurring themes of the novel include the abdication of men from relationships in times of crisis, gender imbalances magnified by poverty, sex work, and the trauma of survivor's guilt of those who managed to survive the Great Depression. The success of No Bed of Her Own convinced Lewton to quit his job writing publicity at MGM's New York City office, but 4 books later, 3 under the pseudonym Carlos Keith, great success failed to materialize. His mother put him in touch with David O. Selznick, who wanted to enlist a Russian-born writer to pen a screen adaptation of Nikolai Gogol's Taras Bulba. Lewton was hired to do the treatment in 1933 and moved to California. The adaptation never materialized, but he began a new career as story editor and assistant to Selznick, which lasted until 1942. At that point, he was offered a job at RKO Radio Pictures, heading a production unit specializing in low-budget horror films. Already known for its history of excessive extravagance and shaky finances, RKO entered into receivership in early 1933. Under studio president George J. Schaefer, the studio slogan was "Quality Pictures at a Premium Price," with an eye for signing prestigious independent producers and talent such as Samuel Goldwyn and Howard Hawks. Frequently, however, Schaefer's agreements were so favorable to his contractors that it was persistently difficult for the studio to turn a profit, even if these works performed well at the box office and or received critical acclaim. Though several of the studio's prestige pictures died at the box office in the late 30s and early 40s, by legend, things came to a head with 3 productions by Orson Welles: Citizen Kane in 1941, The Magnificent Ambersons in 1942, and the aborted documentary It's All True, which combined drained a hefty $2 million from the studio coffers. In 1942, Schaefer resigned, and was replaced by Charles Kerner, whose drastic revamping of the studio's policy and image was conveyed in its new corporate motto: showmanship in place of genius, a new deal at RKO. With an established history of making more money from its B-movie units than from its A prestige pictures, Kerner wanted to strike while the iron was hot during the box office boom of the war period to turn the studio's fortunes around. One of his brainchildren was a division focused exclusively on producing low-budget horror films in order to compete with Universal. With Lewton at the helm, these films were required to not exceed budgets of $125,000, to not exceed running times of 75 minutes, and for their scripts to adhere to titles supplied by studio supervisors, whose eyes would be trained on sensationalism. The first such title to come down the pipeline was Cat People, a clear attempt to cash in on Universal's recent hit with The Wolfman. Despite executive expectations, however, Lewton had no interest in making horror films of the Universal type, and would eschew the growing trend of kiddie matinee cliches of the genre in favor of more psychologically driven and adult-oriented thrillers. Did you see Cat People when you were growing up? Yeah, so it must have played on TV. What did you think of it
Well, back when I was younger, I was very bored with it.
Yeah?
Yeah. I mean, it's one of those things, again, it's one of those movies you can't appreciate until you see it when you're older. And it takes on a quality of, really, it's a melodrama film noir with a supernatural aspect to it. But other than that, it's a really good picture. It's by the numbers, I would think. There's no real deviation in it. It goes from start to finish. Everything's set up appropriately. I think it's just really a well-done film. Sets are beautiful. Absolutely gorgeous sets.
Yeah, a lot of them are repurposed, though. Yeah, the movie was made for a pittance. But it's just like you're saying, and with you, it's more coming from the perspective of someone who grew up in the 50s, where what's on television is a lot more, again, beginning with those Universal movies, especially with their late war period movies, and then extending into the sort of exploitation era of the 50s. It's much more about the idea of these movies being like these sort of child matinee monster rallies, where it's like Frankenstein, the Wolfman, Dracula, all in one picture. But you are right that the movie, The Cat People, by design by Lewton himself, is definitely not... It's not only not a conventional monster movie, it's also not really kid-oriented. The themes of the movie are far more concerned with number one, it seems, love and sexuality, but also, there, like you're saying, with its sort of anticipation of the noir movie, these themes in it of depression and fatalism and the blurring of the line between what is a product of the mind and what exists in reality, and whether someone's pathology can be so strong that it basically manifests something into the real world. And the movie is highly concerned with questions of the mind over questions of the monster itself. Of course, Cat People is not a movie about a woman who transforms into some kind of hokey, who cross-dissolves into some sort of hokey cat monster. We never see her transform into the cat monster on screen. The only times that we actually see the panther that she does transform into is during a scene very late in the film where her soon-to-be ex-husband, played by Kent Smith, and his lover, played by Jane Randolph, they're in their offices at this boat architectural firm, and they're locked in, and the panther is prowling around. And the only reason that the panther appears in those scenes is because RKO saw the original cut of the movie and demanded that Jacques Tourneur shoot shots of a Black Panther prowling around, as originally scripted.
But it wasn't, though. It was a shadow of the panther.
No, you see images of the panther. You see shots of the panther just crawling around.
Oh, you do? That's terrible.
Yeah, it is terrible.
Because
it ruins the whole scene.
I mean, one of the best scenes is the pool scene.
Yes.
Where she dives into the pool.
And it's all sound.
It's all sound, and it's perfect.
Yeah,
there's one... And she's a pretty good actress, swimming, treading water for that. God knows how long it took him to shoot that.
Yeah.
To do the
it
takes.
Must have been very cold.
Yeah, well, geez, so...
But yeah, you're right, with that...
I mean, it's really a remarkable thing, and then it's really... It works.
It almost
so
ruins the picture when once they show the actual panther.
Right.
But again, you see the disconnect, because Jacques Tourneur... And this would be a thing throughout Jacques Tourneur's career. He would get into the same issue with the producers of his later movie, The Night of the Demon, released in the U.S. as Curse of the Demon, where in that film, he also was adamant that you would not show the demon in the movie, that it would all be a psychological... It looks like
it's on rollerblades.
Exactly. But then the producers say, no, you got to show the monster. And in this case, it's even worse, because it's not even like a cool... or at least like quaint-looking monster suit. It's literally just a panther that's just, it's not even prowling or stalking anybody. It's just walking around under a desk, and it completely destroys the illusion of there anything being
sinister. It doesn't look sinister enough.
Well, it doesn't even look supernatural, because that's the whole thing. Is that it's not supposed to be a panther. It's supposed to be a woman, exactly, some sort of
transformated,
a shapeshifter, a being of witchcraft and demonic possession.
Right.
It just destroys the credibility of the whole thing.
I think that I didn't realize that the Wolfman. You have to see the original Wolfman with Lon Chaney. Again, like these films, I was more frightened of the Wolfman than the Cap. Well, Cap Heel, like I said, bored me. Now as an adult,
yeah, because it's like we said,
there's no monster.
There's no monster, but it's also, it's not just that there's no monster. It's because it's not a movie about a monster. It's a movie about a failed marriage.
But I never realized that.
It's an adult-oriented psychological drama.
It's like everything's filler to a kid. Why do you have so much filler? Show me the monster, right?
Yeah, now that we've been going through this series, we could say that it is a sort of gothic horror movie.
Yes.
It is about the sort of monstrosity in people, but even so far with the gothic horror movies we've seen, I don't think we've seen anything that is so bare bones and down to basics about what that means in terms of gothic horror, where yes, it literally is not about a monster. It is about this monstrous side and the sort of bleak nature of people, in this case, to want to inflict evil upon the world, even despite our own... But you were saying about the Wolfman, I'm sorry.
No, it's just interesting that you bring that up, that Universal's hit was the Wolfman. Mm-hmm. Again, the Wolfman, you don't see the Wolfman until the final scene. It's really the final scene where Claude Rains kills the Wolfman, Lon Chaney, with the silver cane. It's basically an adult movie, and it's the same thing. There's a love interest, Lon Chaney. It's just a really remarkable film. Again, shot beautifully, but not as well as the Cat People.
No,
I have to admit, both of Universal's pictures, The Wolfman, and previous to that, the 1935 film, The Werewolf of London.
Yes,
another excellent adult film. But there you see the monster more often. But it has the same kind of love triangle or love tension going on.
And also the sort of the implied sort of sexual violence, the sort of psychosexual subtext of it, where
sort of,
is the Wolfman like representing the sort of rapacious, nature of men, that like this guy sort of becomes compelled by this uncontrollable urge to destroy.
Like Jim Carrey in The Mask, right? So,
exactly.
What does he turn into? Woo, woo, woo.
Exactly. Yes. No. It's true. It's true. Definitely.
I don't know if that's part of it. I just think that these. But I was very interested in the fact that when I read that at least the Wolfman was it was as successful. I don't think the Cat People was as successful as
well, I'm not sure what their comparative success was. I do know that the Cat People was one of RKO's biggest money earners from the year that it was released, and that came even after the final cut was screened to RKO executives, and they hated the movie because, again, we gave you a movie called Cat People. We were trying to make a ripoff of the Wolfman, and you gave us this dour, depressing, slowly paced drama about a marriage where the primary conflict is that a wife won't have sex with her husband. It's like, how are we gonna sell this? Like, we have all these posters made up of fucking a giant evil cat. People are going to be coming to Cat People to see a monster cat.
Well, is that always the case? That the poster is often more shocking and provoking, and it turns out the movie doesn't pan out to the poster. I mean, but that's beside the point.
But that's the thing is, Lewton was just never going to do it. Like Lewton from the get-go.
That's amazing. He got that much. He had that much. Well, like you said, they turned it over to him.
Yeah, Charles Kerner, who was in head of RKO at the time, he, it's like basically his only MO was just to get RKO out of the red. And so basically, this was the period for Lewton where he had the most creative control, not the most economic control. Because again, I think we will get into it later where there are parts of Cat People that it is a sort of a compromised movie, but it definitely is this sort of very unique product of his vision. Basically at Lewton's own discretion, he assembled all of the major film crew himself, and most of the major film crew were people that he had made connections with when he in his previous job being a personal assistant to David O. Selznick at MGM. So Jacques Tourneur, he was a French director who began working under contract for MGM in the late 30s, but who mostly just directed shorts for the company. Lewton had met him when he was working when Tourneur was working as second unit director on the 1935 adaptation of The Tale of Two Cities, and Lewton and he had worked together to direct the Bastille storming sequences from that film. When Lewton was a story editor for an adaptation of Jane Eyre that didn't materialize, that's how he met the screenwriter DeWitt Bodine, who is credited as the screenwriter of this project. But in actuality, the screenplay of the film is more or less a product of not just Bodine, but also Tourneur and Lewton, and even the editor, Mark Robson, working together to kind of craft this story. And ultimately, this is another thing, is that Lewton except for one case, Lewton never took any story or screenwriting credits on the movies he produced, but he was well known as a guy who was if not more directly involved in the writing of his films than the screenwriters he hired. Like, he was notorious for working many sleepless nights on every aspect of the movie, from the cinematography to the production design, and including the script, and all of the shooting drafts of the movies he produced, he wrote himself. So I think we can consider Cat People to be, despite it being a collaborative project, we can consider it to be a unique product of Lewton himself. Also, the cinematographer for the film, Nicholas Musaraka, he's sort of he's one of the pioneers, along with Greg Toland, who did cinematography for Citizen Kane. He's one of the pioneers of the sort of chiaroscuro photography and lighting that would become part of the established definitive visual conventions of film noir. So there's that film noir connection of how the movie sort of informs and is connected to genres besides horror. So there is this one aspect of it where Lewton's entire hiring was exclusively to go against the culture that had the culture of the Wells filmmaker, which is the idea of you're not particularly concerned with finance, you're not particularly concerned with what's popular, you're just trying to make a work of art. But the irony is that, and the film critic Kim Newman has commented on this, is that if anything, despite their incredibly low budgets, Val Lewton's movies are almost creatively like a successor to the films of Orson Welles than they are a contradiction of them. And you can see that with The Cat People. Again, this movie that was produced exclusively to try to cash in on what Universal was making, but in the process, because of the person that they hired and because they were able to work effectively with a very low budget, turns in this movie that, is continues to be one of the most highly praised horror movies of all time, precisely because it's the exact opposite of what they wanted, because it's made by a guy who, was viscerally, not engaged with that idea of showmanship over art, who was viscerally disengaged with the idea that we're just going to put out patronizing slop to people and see what they eat up, like he was trying to do.
Well, I don't think anybody does that, really.
Well,
I do, and I think that's what I like to touch on. That what rescues a lot of these pictures and makes them so surprising, I think it's luck that they become successful monetarily. I think that's it. Citizen Kane, for example, is a very remarkably well-done film. It's just that it wasn't popular at the time, but now you're mesmerized watching it. I haven't seen the Magnificent Albertsons, but it's still Ambersons, but
the Magnificent Albertsons.
Well, that was a sequel.
That's a Chris Rock movie.
But the idea is that they, I never saw that one, but it still has very good reviews, despite the fact that Wells hated it after it was edited.
Well, they took it away from him.
Right.
Yes, they just...
Because they had to.
They didn't have to.
They ran into the ground. I mean, the guy was like a money pit. So what are you going to do, right?
Well, yeah, he was the Napoleonic director. He did not care. But yeah, anyway, Lewton, apparently, when Lewton informed his screenwriter Bodine of the title of the movie, Bodine quotes him as saying, "If you want to get out now, I won't hold it against you." So he was very conscious of the fact that this is what he was doing. He was taking a patently stupid...
Well, who shot it, though? Who's the film?
Nicholas Musaraca.
The point is that, he wrote it, but man, the person who shot it...
but he hired Musaraca based on his appreciation of his photography.
Yeah. I mean,
that's the thing.
What makes it work
Lewton used his... That's the thing that is...
Isn't that important? Like, he had the prestige in order to attract a very good...
he didn't have prestige.
Well, Lewton didn't?
He didn't have prestige. He just had a company that had hired him for a job that was, by definition, going to be very low stakes. And so again, that's the part where the luck comes in. Well, the luck comes in where you just have a studio executive of the type like Charles Kerner, who just wants to hand down his mandate, who just wants to give people the budgets that he says they need to work with, but who ultimately doesn't care what the movie is, because, again, he doesn't care if the movie is art or not. He just cares if it makes money. the luck, that's where the luck comes in, where Lewton is like, oh, I'm in this incredibly advantageous position to, as long as I'm shooting it for this amount and over this amount of time, I can basically just choose whoever I want.
Well, it was only 128,000, right? 120 something?
Yeah, 120,
I
a
mean,
little under, and this is the thing,
absolutely amazing.
It ultimately came in at like 122,000, and that actually overshot its budget. Its original budget was somewhere like 180,000, and it's actually went over budget and over schedule. So again, this is the part where luck comes in, is that like, so that is the part where the box office success comes in as luck, because if that movie had not turned out well, like, Lewton certainly would have been out of the job, especially with a movie that the executives hated, that they didn't understand, that they felt,
right,
betrayed by this asshole who took their money, and not only their money, but more money than he was originally budgeted for, and he made this adult-oriented melodrama about anxiety and depression and sex.
And the fickle nature of love, like when he says, I'm not sure whether I am in love with her.
Yeah, that's a great
Why? Because
scene.
he's cuckolded or whatever, or because he sees that something strange about her. It isn't quite clear.
I think we'll get into that once we're dissecting the plot. But yeah, let's talk about like the formulation, the development of this movie, because there are basically three most well-known influences on the early development of the Cat People. So as soon as they get the title Cat People, the first thing that Val Lewton and Bodine and Tourneur do is that they just start doing a massive amount of research on cats, paganism, the occult, the history of witchcraft, and stories of that kind, because again, they are just trying to find an intelligent, well-researched way of going about this story that has to be about a cat person of some kind.
Right.
And so there are three stories that are very influential upon the development. The first is, I think the first one of note is Margaret Irwin's Monsieur Seeks a Wife. This is a 1934 short story. It takes place in the 18th century. It's about a French aristocrat who returns home, and he's basically, again, like the title suggests, he's seeking a wife. He has to choose between these three daughters of this old-fashioned French nobleman, and then one of the daughters, it turns out, is basically a witch. Her familiar is a cat, who, and like, basically the story is only very loosely related to the film as it finally developed, but like, it does involve, again, those themes of witchcraft, transformation, sexual anxiety, and even because it's written by Margaret Irwin, there's also like sort of not unsubtle themes about women's independence, and the fact that they're basically just objects in this period setting to be used for to establish political and economic bonds between royal families, and to basically establish themselves rather than anything to do with love or what makes people happy or equality or anything. The other was Algernon Blackwood's Ancient Sorceries, which is a 1906 story, which is one of the three original stories that Blackwood wrote, centering on the psychic doctor John Silence, who was basically like a paranormal version of Sherlock Holmes. The three John Silence stories are all the same, where they begin with John Silence recalling a case where he interviewed a patient of his over their encounters with the occult and the supernatural. And in Ancient Sorceries, it's all about this sort of unremarkable English tourist who is traveling in France, and he decides impulsively to leave a crowded train to lodge in a small village that at first it seems idyllic, but he slowly learns that it's populated by witches. And they don't just have cat. In that story, it's not just that the cats are familiars. The entire town, all of the witches have the power to transform themselves into giant black cats. So that's one thing that was an influence on the early development of the movie. Perhaps the most influential, though, is a is a story by Ambrose Bierce, written in 1897, Ambrose Bierce is more famous. In English, in high school English, everyone reads An Occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge. The story seems to be the most directly influential on the plot of Cat People is this story that he wrote in 1897 called The Eyes of the Panther. And the story of The Eyes of the Panther, it should sound very familiar to you. So there's a woman in the story named Irene, and the protagonist of the Cat People is named Irina. And she's the love interest of the story's protagonist, a young attorney named Jenner Bratting. Bratting is intent on marrying Irene, but she refuses his advances, and basically explains that it's because she believes she's insane. And she tells him this story about how she is actually her parents' second daughter, and that the previous one to her had died in a traumatic incident, which is explained to us, where basically what happens is that, Irene's father is a woodsman. He goes out one night to hunt despite his wife's premonitions of something bad's going to happen. She goes to bed and has a dream in which her current child is dead, the one before Irene, and she's looking upon its replacement, and she finds that it has this horrible, wild animal face. Basically like Rosemary's Baby. If you can imagine that climactic scene in Rosemary's Baby where she looks at the baby and she's like, what have you done to its eyes? She wakes up and she sees at the open window, there's just a black panther just staring at her in the darkness with its green eyes. And so she curls up in the corner of the room, clutching her baby in defense. And then Irene's father returns. He discovers the wife is unharmed, but that she has accidentally suffocated the baby because of how terrified she was. And so we return to the present. Bratting connects Irene's story to this recent local myth of a similar voyeuristic panther that sort of is haunting the local town. We further learn that Irene's father has, he's developed a reputation as a recluse, that it's only until recently that he's even allowed his daughter to take visitors or allowed her to go out at night. Anyway, Irene is consumed with grief, so she runs off into the woods. And so then on another evening after Irene has disappeared, Bratting wakes up and sees the panther at his open window. He shoots the panther, and then he follows the trail of blood, and he finds not the panther's body, but he finds Irene's body. So we can already see the, superficial details that are directly informing the plot of the Cat People. Number one, just the similarity of the characters' names is very telling. Irene, Irina. There's also the premise of, in Cat People, it's not that Kent Smith's character, Oliver, it's not that he wants to get married to Irina, played by Simone. It's not that he wants to get married, but she won't. It's that they do get married, but she can't consummate the marriage because and again, it's connected to a traumatic story of her childhood, where in this case, instead of the death of the child, it's the death of her father. It's this backstory that's explained after she's hypnotized by Dr. Judd, played by Tom Conway, the psychologist. He hypnotizes her and he puts her through this regression to tell her about her childhood. She's basically comes from a small Siberian town where there are these legends that, after the Ottomans were driven out by the Christians, that everyone in the town was discovered to have succumbed to witchcraft and Satanism, and so they were all put to the sword, but the wisest and the most wicked survived, and that they have, whenever they are aroused or jealous, or whenever the desire to inflict evil on the world overtakes them, they transform into giant black cat people. And so there's that connection of the death of the father, where her father died when she was young and she never knew her, and the village children would make fun of her and say that her mother was a cat person, and so she believes that she is like a cat person, that there's a part of her that if she gives in to the temptation to consummate her love with Kent, that she's going to be transformed. And of course culminating in the final sequence of the film, where she is injured in a fight, not with Kent Smith, but with Judd's character. Everyone follows the trail of blood, but where the imagery is reversed. Now, instead of following the trail of the Panther and discovering the woman's body, they follow the trail of Arena and they discover the Panther's body. So very subtle differences, but moreover, the template of the movie is there. Originally, Lewton was intent on doing an adaptation of Blackwood's story, Ancient Sorceries, and he was even going to acquire the film rights to the story. But, and so such an adaptation, it would have been, you know, it would have been like a lot more like a conventional period horror movie, like, you know, Frankenstein or The Wolfman, a remote rustic setting somewhere displaced from America, much more explicit supernatural goings on. At the last minute, he decides that you know, period settings are exactly the wrong way to go about it. And not just a period setting, but he decides that a rural or rustic or old world setting are the exact wrong conventions, because he decides that's what's been played out already. That's what people are used to seeing. What he wants to do is he wants to make a contemporary, urban-based movie with minimal emphasis on the occult and the supernatural as possible. And, you know, and so according to Tourneur, the reasoning was to the effect of, quote, if you're going to have horror, the audience must be able to identify with the characters in order to be frightened. And we can see how that informs the making of the movie, because one of Lewton's stipulations in the writing process it's a deceptively simple one, isn't it? Because one of his stipulations was, we have to see the characters at work.
Toward the shear line. 62 degrees.
Hey.
I'm sorry. I must have given you the wrong figure. Let me try again.
Wait, let's have a cigarette first. That's the third wrong figure you've given me this morning.
We have to see them having a job. We have to see what they're doing from 9 to 5. It can't just be what is conventional for horror movies, which is that you virtually never see the characters, you virtually never know what a character's job is, much less see them at work. Everything begins from this heightened, removed premise of being old or removed from reality or in this dark place. Cat People begins with the premise of, this is the world as we know it. This is the modern world of urbanity and of civilization and of mundanity, which is, you know, you could see why you were bored as a kid. Is that, like, you know, it begins from this premise of, this is just the normal goings on of the everyday world. And sort of Lewton's ingenious idea was, we begin there, and then we slowly tease out over the course of the film the sort of descent of the characters into this world of darkness and this world of the mind and the world of the occult, rather than beginning from a place of removal.
Lose evil from the world. There is in some cases a psychic need to lose evil from the world. There is in some cases a psychic need, a desire for death, to lose evil. Desire for death, the psychic need, the key, the key, the key.
There's lots of ways to go about interpreting the Cat People. And so besides, you know, like you had said that there's things about it that you can look at it as an adult that you appreciated on an aesthetic level, but I sort of wanted to get your bead on, you know, like, substantively, what do you think the movie is about, per se?
There's a certain tension in it that is, it's using the supernatural to tell a typical story of, you know, whether or not you really fall in love and whether you really love a person or not.
Yeah.
Because there's no real development of that, because it's edited. I mean, the pace at which it works, all of a sudden he's in love with her. I mean, the idea is you only see 3 scenes of them, and then he's in love with her. So, I mean, I understand the jump in it and stuff like that, and I get the point. That's one of the drawbacks I thought in the film.
Yeah, I think it's true that I think it's this was Lewton's first producing gig, and it is his first attempt at taking a sort of low aspiration production and try to make something better out of it. And I think I agree that in retrospect, there are aspects of the film that feel very perfunctory. There is some beautifully done photography and editing in the film, but there are certain sequences, especially with the psychiatrist, with Tom Conway's Dr. Judd, that do feel very perfunctory and very sort of stagey and unevocative. But I think that triangle between Irina, Simone's character, Oliver, Kent Smith's character, and then Jane Randolph's character, Alice.
Mm-hmm.
I think that is a very interesting relationship, because you're right, it is sort of this classic Hollywood scenario where people just meet in, a park in the zoo one day, and of course Irina is doing sketches of the Black Panther in its cage, and they meet in the park. They go up to her apartment and have tea, and then, after dinner the next night, again, you're right, they spend 2 nights together.
Well, no, the film says that probably was longer, but the idea is that that's what it feels like. But it's obviously more than that.
Yeah, the movie is supposed to...
It's all right. It's okay.
But it is sort of this love at first sight quality.
Right.
But what I think is interesting, and you mentioned this earlier in the episode, where there is this quality where, unlike a lot of movies that have that sort of love at first sight scenario, there is a part in the movie where 2 characters actually discuss love. And at one point, it happens where, it's sort of at the later point in their marriage. It's been a month, and Tom and Kent Smith's character still hasn't had consummated his relationship with his wife. He's still dealing with the fact that she has what he believes to be a psychosis that makes her believe that she's incapable of affection because she's going to lash out at him. And Alice Moore, or Jane Randolph's character Alice, she confesses her love for him, and in the process they have a conversation about love, and Kent Smith admits that he doesn't really know what love is.
He thought he did.
And I think that's interesting, because clearly again, that's not something that you typically find in a classical Hollywood movie where it addresses explicitly that idea of...
But the trope comes out again and again. So in a Wolfman, I mean, similarly, the woman that plays Lon Chaney's interest is theoretically having somewhat of a relationship with the groundskeeper, who's head of the groundskeeper for the estate. And they're groundskeeper, the game, whatever he was, game warden or whatever he was, and you see it again also in the Werewolf of London. Very similar type of thing, where the young bride of the scientist who becomes the werewolf meets an old friend who's a reporter from America, and
it inspires jealousy and the sort of subtext.
So this trope is not unusual. However, I have to admit that this is probably the best done of them.
Yeah.
The reason is because all the characters are sort of they're fleshed out better.
Yeah.
So the other ones, they're a little bit, they're a little weaker. Werewolf of London's pretty good, I think, because you almost can see that she's not fit for this scientist. Why did she even marry him?
Yeah.
So here it's less...
It's less that the characters... Right. It's less that the characters don't fit for each other, and more of that it's just that it's sort of getting at the heart of it, where the movie is sort of admitting that this entire love at first sight fantasy is unrealistic. And not just that it's unrealistic, but that it's not really love. That over the course of the film, Oliver basically realizes that he's not in love with Irina. He's just captivated by her.
Right.
And that's not the same thing. He's just obsessed with this superficial fragility and innocence that she has, which only leads into a situation where they're both torturing each other. And this is part of why I love Alice as a character, because, in addition to, again, being this sort of, she, in the film, she jokingly refers to herself as the new other woman, which is to say she's the new woman that you have an affair with who doesn't have sex with you and also has her own job and is socially independent and is not really dependent on anybody, is particularly a man. And it's great because before he goes into his explanation of what he thought love was, she sort of gives her own explanation of what love is. And crucially, again, like, it has nothing to do with people being obsessed with one another. It has nothing to do with, like, oh, I die for you, or I feel so, I'm torturing myself over it. It's the exact opposite. It's basically just like you find someone who you're friendly with and you care about, and you just decide, I take you as you are.
I know what love is. It's understanding. It's you and me, and let the rest of the world go by. It's just the two of us living our lives together, happily and proudly. No self-torture, no doubt. It's enduring and it's everlasting. Nothing can change it. Nothing can change us, Ollie. That's what I think love is.
Well, that isn't the way I feel about Irena.
Which is the crucial thing, because take someone as they are and not try to change them, because there's this whole basically, at the most basic, the metaphor of the film, or the allegory of it, is that Oliver finds himself in a relationship with a woman who, let's just take cat people and witchcraft and all that stuff, let's take it totally out of the equation. It's a story about a woman who basically has severe depression. She's isolated, she's antisocial, she has a severe aversion to physical contact. And he spends the whole movie trying to save her from this, to try to reform her, to get her to go to a psychiatrist, to try to make her better. But far from making the situation better, it just makes both of them feel more tortured, and it ultimately culminates in the total breakup and all of this trauma. And so at the very basic level, the metaphor for the movie is fundamentally about trying to force someone to change, to conform to your idea of what they were in your mind, rather than accepting that love is not a fairy tale, that love is it's a partnership where you rely on the person as they are and not as what you want them to be. Right. And I think I think it's wonderfully done. I think the acting is very good. I don't think Kent Smith is as good an actor as his two leading ladies. He's not bad.
He's very popular. I mean, he has a good run in TV, movies, and TV series. So he does have a run after this, and he's used a lot as a but major character in other types of things, mainly to television after this. So. But you're right, he's not as strong or as convincing as the women in here. The women are much better at and even the other surrounding characters are much better. And he's not that well even in the sequel. So, I mean, but that's all right. He does.
It might work in a kind of way. It might work in a kind of way because he does come off. It's not just that he's like a kind of everyman figure. He really is such an oaf. Like, he's just like it's great because in that very same scene with Alice, he basically just admits that, like, the reason I'm having such a hard time with this is because I've never had a hard time in my life. Everything's been handed to me. Everything has come easy. Right. And so now when there's just the smallest bit of resistance, I literally don't know what to do. He's sort of like he's like a remarkably dumb and ineffectual, but at least by the standards of the time, a totally ineffectual male protagonist. And I think what it does really well is...
I think he moves the plot along, right?
Well,
so
he
really,
doesn't move the plot...
Well, he's there.
He's
so
exactly. He's just sort of there. And
Right.
it's so... And I think it clarifies the fact that the protagonist of the story is not Oliver trying to...
It's really Alice and the other guy.
It's really
Simone.
Arena. Yeah,
Right.
Arena is
and Alice.
That fundamentally this is a movie being told from Arena's perspective, her view of the world, and that this projects this sort of bleakness onto the entire state of things, where again you could completely remove all of the aspects of the supernatural,
right,
and you would still have fundamentally the same story. It would just culminate in a murder suicide rather than a
right, or she become like Fatal Attraction. She becomes crazy and tries to kill everybody, and
which is kind of what happens. But it's like but it's identifiable because it's like she told him from the very beginning, I am a crazy bitch. I don't think you want this with me, even though I want it with you. And he's like, nah, you'll be fine. Just listen to me. It's like, buck up, kiddo. It's like, it's all of these things that we've seen time and time again watching, not movies from the 40s. We've concentrated on the 50s, but it's in the same wheelhouse where we've seen this time and time again. Just this profoundly insulting and repulsive patronizing of any time a woman just states how she feels, and just this minimization of how she assesses a situation, where the cat people is I think it's the first movie that we've actually seen where that's actually the point. The point is that we're supposed to empathize with Arena, that she is being put in this situation where she's telling everyone, I literally can't engage with the world. I have something inside me that wants to lash out and destroy everything. Basically, she's just admitting to them that, like, I want to destroy things. Like, I'm angry, I'm depressed, I don't see any purpose in life. Everything seems cruel and meaningless, and I want to hurt myself or somebody else. And nobody listens to her, and it's all transmuted. And it is connected to, I think, sexual and gender norms at the time. It is related to a sort of patriarchal norm at the time. Immediately Oliver sends us to our fourth major character, Dr. Judd, the psychologist.
Psychiatrist?
The psychiatrist. Well, whatever he is. But, it's weird because over the course of the film, it becomes clear that he just sort of develops this, very unethical sexual fixation with Arena, where it's clear that basically he believes that basically all that needs to be done in order to cure her of her pathology is basically that she just needs to be taken. Basically, she just needs to be compelled to do what she doesn't want to do. He's a very gross guy.
He is. Even from the very beginning, there's something off about him right from the first scene.
Yes.
Do you know there's something...
We don't even see him in the first scene. The scene opens with her under hypnosis. It's just a spotlight on her face, and all we hear is his voice from the shadows, and then the light turns on and he's introduced to us. And it's great, but you're right, it's this very nefarious way of introducing him that tells us a lot before we really start to learn what his actual intentions are.
Really are, yes.
And and of course it only just hammers home just what a doofus Oliver is, because this is the guy that he sent his wife to in order to cure her of her sexual pathology, of her frigidity, and the guy he's sending her to is trying to bang his wife, and he's just completely oblivious to the fact that there's something off about this guy. And that's where the climax of the movie comes. So basically,
because he locks the door and unlocks it so he can get in when she's there.
Yeah. So, like, basically over the course of the film, the marriage between Oliver and Arena breaks down. The romance between him and Alice flourishes.
And the psychiatrist conveniently says you can get an annulment because he's after something different.
Yeah, so you can get an annulment if she's declared insane.
Right. But you have to put her away, though.
You have to put her away, though. Yeah, you have to have her come in. Well, which is again, it's like but the the Panther in Irina is aroused at first by her jealousy of Alice.
Right.
And, this sort of there are several scenes in the film of her stalking Alice and Oliver, including the pool scene you mentioned, which is a fantastic scene in the movie. But ultimately, the climactic fight of the movie is not between Alice and Irina, or Oliver and Alice. It's between Alice and Judd. So I accidentally said that it was between Alice and Dr. Judd. What I actually, of course, I mean it's between Irina and Judd. I accidentally substitute Irina with Alice a couple of times, so just know that whenever I say Alice, when it's with regards to Dr. Judd, I do mean Irina, the cat person. Yes. Right. So Alice returns to her apartment. She finds Judd there. He has snuck his way back in the apartment to await for her, and he's basically, like this typical slimy greaseball character. He's just convinced that she's attracted to him. There's even a previous scene where he basically, he literally advances himself upon her, and she literally says, I would not like to kiss you, and he accuses her of lying. He's a really fucking slimy character, but he kisses her, and then the Panther is aroused in her, and we have this great fight scene, which is all done with their shadows projected on the wall of him fighting with this Panther. What's interesting, and it only makes sense when you get into Irina's backstory, because basically the story is that she comes from a Serbian village where they have a legend that their people were originally basically burned in mass as witches, and that they have the power to transform themselves into cat people in order to inflict evil on the world. The ostensible hero who saved her town from witchcraft and Satanism is King John of Serbia, who's the great Christian king. She has a sculpture of him.
Yeah, that's how I can figure out where she get the sculpture.
Yeah, well, she has a sculpture of him in her... Well, she's just very proud of her heritage. She has a sculpture of him in her apartment with the Panther impaled on a sword. And it's this... What's interesting is that she has a dream sequence later in which she sees Dr. Judd as King John unfurling his sword.
Right.
So there's already this association that's being built up in her mind. So again, it is this sort of thing. So Judd's not entirely lying. She is attracted in some way to Judd.
No, and he's actually going to find out.
Right.
That he's actually going to peel back the layers and discover her. So it's hard to tell whether she has the feelings for him or not, or that he symbolizes anything other than the fact that he's going to pry open and figure out.
There's also seems to be a sort of Freudian angle to it. She idolized, it's weird because she believes all of these things about herself, that she is fundamentally this damned monster. But she idolizes King John of Serbia, the one who has killed her people. So there's this other more obvious theme going through the movie of this idea of religious repression and of shame, and how people internalize intrinsic shame about their own natural, organic desires, which are handed down through a history of religious authority. And so she projects onto Judd this model of King John of Serbia. And so then there's this clash between them at the end of the film. And also, Judd has a sword cane. For some reason, Judd is just walking...
for protection. A lot of them had walking sticks with protection. Either it was at the tip,
right,
or it was actually within the stem where you took it apart. Right. It's much easier to have it at the tip. You hit the thing and then you use it. It's harder when you have to take it apart, because then you need to take it apart. Right. So Yeah, it's not uncommon for that, though.
Right.
It's
so
not uncommon.
the climax. So the climax of the film basically becomes the clash between these two historical forces. Again, these people who Judd not even realizing that he is basically like a reincarnated figure. That it's almost like fate. That the fate has been drawing these two characters together over the course of millennia, and finally the witches have come back from the dark, margins that to which they were forced to by Enlightenment and Christian civilization, and now they're going to fight with the new forces of authority and of rationalism and civilization. Except the difference is that the forces of darkness win. the Judd gets killed, and there's also this his cane sword breaks off after he stabs her. So Irina is mortally wounded, but she is victorious in the battle. And there is also this rather, it's almost like this sort of castration imagery where he has plunged his sword into the heart of the beast, but rather than this phallic weapon working to subdue this monstrous pagan feminine entity, it completely dissipates under the power of this thing. And ultimately she has to be ultimately it's not that he kills her, it's that she dooms herself, because she's conflicted by these feelings of shame and the belief that she really can't live in the world the way she is. So basically the end of the movie is that she just commits suicide, though her last act is she's obsessed with this panther that lives in the zoo near her apartment, and she is able to get the key because the fucking groundskeeper keeps accidentally leaving the key in the lock. And there's this great scene where she steals the key, and you get these insert shots of the panther noticing her while it's eating, and then as she leaves, just the panther he stops,
looks at her.
Yeah, it's fucking great. And then when it cuts away from her leaving, the panther is just up from its food, eyes wide, what the hell is she up to? And then so she lets the panther go, and of course it's terrible because, and again, it's such a tragic denouement to the movie. Again, it's this very bleak movie because she lets the panther go, and it's sort of number one, it's almost like her last stab at the world, that she deep down, like Dr. Judd says, it's like this. It's not even just a function of her being a cat person. It's a function of deep down in all people, there's this desire to lash out and to, the fight or flight instinct that tells us to do these destructive things just because it will satisfy some nascent instinctual urge. And so she lets the panther go, and it's almost like it's a familiar to her, because it's like her last act of just chaos and evil against the world, but she's also liberating it. She identifies with the creature as they're both sort of these beings in a cage that are put on display and are just sort of idolized and enchanted, but are also, they're locked up for a reason, that they're savage and chaotic in a way that can't conform to the civilized world. And then the panther just gets hit by a taxi. And it really is. And I remember you were particularly sad when the panther got killed. I think you were more sad when the panther died than when Irina did.
I mean, she commits suicide simply because that, I think she never really knew whether she was a cat or not, right? So the point is that once she knew that she was one, then she knew she had that there's no cure for her, nor is there any purpose of her in the modern world, and so she commits suicide. She figures that this is what her life is going to be, never loving anyone, never. So because the love brings out the beast in her, right? So, So the cat drives the stake farther into her heart, I guess, and kills her.
And it's also not just that she can't get help. It's that the nature of the world in which she lives is one not of helping her, but of literally just of denying that what she perceives is real.
Right.
That of telling her your intuition is wrong, you have to perform a certain way in order to be accepted, or otherwise you're insane. We're gonna have you committed. It's like it's this very bleak. And it's not just, and this is the thing, is like, it's not just a bleak outlook on the nature of people, about how they fall in love for stupid reasons and how they torture themselves over these things. It's also just a bleak outlook on, like, what is available to such a person as that. What is available to this person.
Well, another male cat person.
Yeah, exactly. Like, yeah, you could easily imagine this story from the perspective of just, like, a student who lives next to a zoo.
Like a cult of werewolves, right? They all know each other.
Yeah.
Like, what's the series, right? It was True Blood, right?
Right.
Vampires all living separate lives than people. There are werewolves, there are whatever. So that's what it becomes. Then that really becomes really kind of stupid in a way, but this is more challenging because it, like you just said, that all of our options are gone.
And it is interesting that so, again, it's so contrary.
Other than people really believing her and then let her live her life.
Exactly.
She won't have a normal
And
relationship.
this is the thing. Exactly.
She's very valuable.
Yeah. What's wrong with just being a woman and not getting married?
Right. Exactly.
But more importantly, what's wrong with being a woman and not wanting to kiss men?
Right.
And that's the thing I say. So this is where I want to start getting into the subtext. But before before even subtext, I just want to talk about how iconoclastic it was for Lewton to not just make this grounded, urban, psychologically based horror movie during the war period. During a period where we were starting to really get into the hype of American propaganda and patriotism and sort of morale-boosting rhetoric. In the middle of this climate, to just put out this bleak, depressing movie about how fucked modern life is and how alienating and isolating it is and how there's no hope.
In New York.
To not just make that movie, but to have it center on a woman. To have her to be the unique vehicle. And I think it does go to the fact that, Lewton was a guy who, for his entire life, was raised around strong women. The only reason he got his first job with David O. Selznick was because his mother was managed the story department at MGM. She was one of the first story editors and the first story manager in Hollywood. Like, she was a very strong woman. She had left his father when he was very young in order to come to America. And in America, he also had an aunt who was this famous Broadway actress and early silent film star who was herself, was notoriously independent and even again, not as much as Simone, but there was a lot of gossip about her, a lot of insinuations. Those insinuations, a lot of them turning out to be true. Like, she wasn't out, but she was bisexual at the time. She was known to have relationships, but not just relationships with both men and women, but one of her first marriages was a marriage of convenience. She married one of her gay co-stars in order to hide his sexuality. She was also known for sort of developing an inner circle of actress and artist types who were basically like an early queer, social group, and a sort of open secret of there being this social circle of homosexuals and bisexual people on Broadway and in Hollywood who could meet with each other and love each other in these ways. But that's the sort of situation that Lewton grew up in, where so much of his influence developmentally was not from a male, authoritarian, patriarchal figure, but from these strong women. And so I think it's interesting that with the Cat People, you see the beginning of one of the biggest motifs of Lewton's films, where even if they don't star a female character, they eventually come to center on this idea of this female who as opposed to the male everyman hero, this woman who is fatalistic and who is alienated, but who embodies all of the anxieties of the filmmaker and who undertakes these journeys into the dark side of reality. And, it's like, so I think what it is fundamentally about the film is that you get the feeling, again, that it's not patronizing, that fundamentally the filmmakers do authentically empathize and identify with, especially Lewton, they identify with Irina as a character, that she is the victim of exploitation. And not just that she's the victim of exploitation by Judd, but, like, it's specifically presented in gendered terms, I think. And we can even see Alice as a part of that. This woman who is self-conscious about the fact that she is the new other woman, that she could, like, live her entire life and not marry Oliver. That she would be okay with that. It's that, she's not torturing herself every day about not being married to Oliver. And I read, like, there was even one critic not a critic of the movie, but a scholar of the movie who said that, like, the way she characterized Oliver's relationship with Alice is that it's weird because despite the fact that Oliver's crisis is that he can't consummate his marriage with Irina, his relationship with Alice is almost asexual in a way. Like, because there's no real moments of, like, passionate intimacy between them. What we see is them working together, solving math problems at work, going to museums where they're just studying boats. They're both boat nerds, which I think is probably the most asexual way that you could characterize them. We see them, like, just going to the diner and having tea and a conversation. It really is so subdued in a way. Mm-hmm. And I think it relates to this idea of the movie being conscious about these changing gender norms, at least in the post-Depression era, but also of this idea that there's something specifically gendered about the crisis of the film. But even more so than that, with Lewton's identification with Irina, I think there's aspects of the film that seem almost if not autobiographical, like maybe autodidact in a way, where she's a projection of Lewton's own anxieties and his own sense of fatalism and his own depression and insomnia and loneliness, which is, heavily, it's been heavily written about just Lewton's character, but also just her background as an immigrant. The fact that she is an immigrant to America and Lewton came to America as a small child, the phobia of cats and also the apparent fear of intimacy. So, Irina's big crisis is that she's afraid of physical intimacy. It turns out that apparently Lewton himself was a very averse to physical contact with people who he was not who he didn't have familial relations with. He wouldn't even shake people's hands. Like, he was very sort of inwardly drawn and afraid of intimate contact. And I also think, as an immigrant, also I'm thinking of, like, the background of Irina as being this woman who presumably, like, if she's not Christian, she comes from a traditional, maybe, I guess, whatever in Serbia is the Christian Church of Serbia, but she comes from a traditional,
right, Orthodox,
a sort of fundamentalist Christian background.
Not fundamentalist,
but that her own blood goes back to this pre-Christian antecedent that has been covered up. It turns out that Val Lewton was Christian, his family was Christian. But in the 18th century, they had converted from Judaism. So ethnically, he was a Russian Jew living as a Christian. So I'm even wondering if, like, there's, like, all these different ways in which the movie is, like, acting as a sort of conduit to all of these ways that people can feel isolated from the world.
Well, isn't it true that all writers have to draw on their background when they write characters?
Well, yeah, but I think it's so...
Why is it... I mean, I don't see. I think it's beautiful that
Right.
it manifests.
I think. Well, that's the
way it
thing. I think it's
manifests.
particularly
Yeah.
well done here.
Yeah,
It's very
because
evocative.
Sure, if you know the person's background, it gives you. It's like art. It's like being a docent in an art.
Yeah.
You really don't appreciate a painting until they tell you the background about it, and you say, "Wow." Then you realize how much power there is in the art in expressing that background. Same thing with this film. What I think which is really more amazing is how it all works, because in order for things to translate from the page to the film, it requires other people to be
Right.
on the same kind of the vein. There's got to be a mind meld.
Yeah. Well, he chose his collaborators well, I think.
But he must have told them about this to some extent, or they must know his background to some extent, because how's the cameraman going to know whether to focus more on one, just to how it's all laid out. So who did the direction on this?
Jacques Tourneur. But like again, like during the writing process, basically everyone was involved.
There we go.
Especially
So they probably knew
Lewton did a lot of the writing himself, and right down to shot choices. Mark Robson, the editor, he even was involved in the writing. So from the very beginning, he was thinking about it also not just in narrative, but aesthetic terms of like how to convey something in a way that was dynamic and evocative and emotional. And it's like, so popular interpretation, the primary popular interpretation of cat people, it tends to focus on the depiction of female arousal as this source of internalized shame for women and potential horror for men. This idea of female sexuality, particularly at the time it was made, as being this thing that we use to stigmatize women, to stigmatize their natural sexual feelings and their innate desires for independence and their ability to choose what they do with their bodies. And also the horror of men in a patriarchal context of that very thing. But there's also, even at the time it was released, there was a prevalent queer reading of the film, which is that Irina's cat person, her other self, it's not just an evocation of her sexual arousal for men. It's an evocation of her repulsion to men. That it's an expression of her lesbianism and bisexuality. So the particular attention, like what people pay particular attention to is the scene on Irina and Oliver's wedding night, where they're in the restaurant, and they're in a Serbian restaurant. That's very important. So they're in a restaurant with people who come from Irina's homeland. And in the restaurant, there's a woman sitting at a table. She's all dressed in black. She's described as looking like a cat. Oh, it's telegraphed pretty obviously. The movie is not particularly subtle just in terms of plot as much as it is in aesthetics. But anyway, like, she approaches Irina at her table, and in their native language, she identifies Irina as my sister.
Moja sestra. Moja sestra?
Irina makes the sign of the cross. The woman leaves, giving her a sly, knowing glance. And so even contemporary to the film's release, this scene was interpreted by some viewers as symbolically representing Irina being called out by a woman who has embraced her dark sexual side and the loneliness that comes with it. That she basically represents this lone, a woman who's alone in this restaurant, who's all dressed in black. She's not again, like a cat. She's very independent. She's not evoking or evincing any desire for male companionship. And she sees Irina, and almost like she has gaydar, she locks in on her and says, you and I are sisters. I don't know if it's that.
I just think that's...
Okay, but wait for it. Okay, so the kinship is further accented by the fact that it's actually Simone's voice that is dubbing the actress in that scene. DeWitt Bodine claimed that Val Lewton once called him into his office after he had received letters from fans of the film, praising him for his boldness in bringing a lesbian subtext to his film. Indignant, Lewton asked Bodine, who had conceived of and written the scene if these inferences were deliberate on his part. Bodine responded, Val, if you write a scene about two strange women and another says to one in a foreign language, my sister, you can bet your ass that there'll be those who say, ah, lesbians. However, later in life, Bodine claimed that he had intended this inference all along. That Irina's fear of intimacy with Oliver is not evocative of her attraction to men being so powerful that she turns into a beast, like this jealous feminine monster, but the opposite. That the beast represents her revulsion, that it's this thing that makes her, when she's forced to kiss a man, she wants to lash out and destroy them. That there's this... So as far as the screenwriter was concerned, there is a queer subtext to the film. And that wouldn't precisely be unusual. Like, there's an antecedent for that in Dracula's Daughter, which I also want to cover as we go through these movies about female monsters. Although with that one, it's the lesbian and bisexual themes are much more explicit. But, I'm just saying, these things are, even if they're not really apparent... I think, there's, at a very baseline level, this is a movie about sexuality and about gender. There's a general way where you can talk about it being a bleak sort of picture of a depressive person and of a controlling society and an alienating society that sort of forces people to contemplate their own destruction. But I think fundamentally that if you're going to exclude Irina's being a woman from the picture, we're fundamentally losing sight of the what is really evocative about the movie, about what keeps the drama sort of relevant to the present day.
Believe me, it's better this way.
Better? Better for whom?
Irina,
Speak. You can't speak. There's nothing you can say. There's only silence. But I love silence. I love loneliness. And they're in me. Their tracks. They're soft. They're soft.
Irina, you're talking like an insane.
Please go. I wanted to go. Please. Go. Go.
Fundamentally, Irina is kind of like an anti-hero. She's a feminist anti-hero representing these women who have internalized shame from living in a history of patriarchal societies, but who represents the return of the witch, taking revenge against these unscrupulous masculine forces, and who's kind of like King Kong. She dies at the end. She's a monster, but she is sacrificed herself in the name of something she loves, which in this case is she attempts to sacrifice herself in the name of the Panther, but the Panther actually dies. So I really did want to talk about both Cat People and its sequel, Curse of the Cat People, but I think we should table that for now and handle Curse of the Cat People next week, just because there's so much to go in about Cat People. I encourage anybody who's listening, anybody who's listening,
it really sips by itself, because the Curse of the Cat People, first of all, it's like Taken 3. There is no curse, and no one was taken. So I don't know where they got the title, and it doesn't. Well,
it was handed down from the RKO execs, and they did whatever they wanted with them.
And it doesn't have any monster in it. It's a beautiful film. Yes. Actually, it's all about life. So I thought it was kind of interesting how there's no relationship at all between these except for sequels.
Yeah.
Anyway, so we could talk about that. That'd be a much faster.
I don't know. I have a lot of things to say about the Curse of the Cat People too, but yeah, I think we'll table that.
It's pretty much straight. Well, I like the
idea because we did do it as a double feature, and it was a fantastic double feature.
It was.
But yeah, I'll end the episode by just saying I encourage my listeners to do more, watch Cat People, but just research Cat People.
No, don't. Just read your notes. You want to put your notes up there, dude?
Well, no. I'll put some show notes to some.
Yeah, I think that's all you
some
do,
scholarly criticism
Yeah.
I've read about cat people.
Sure.
There's also 2 documentaries that I'll list in the show notes. But yeah, look into it, watch the movie, and really, really get into it. Turn off the lights. Really, just sit and stew, because it is like. It is one of, it's even in terms of Val Lewton's whole filmography, it is one of the most depressing and bleak horror movies that I think I've ever seen.
I think it's depressing and bleak, but certainly, because you know why it's so beautifully done that it doesn't have that, that kind of, it doesn't seem that drastic of a thing. Just, just seems like it's well done. You're right.
Yeah.
You're absolutely right.
But yeah, we'll come back next week with a Curse of the Cat People.
Okay.
So stay tuned, everybody, and thanks for joining us on Monster Craze Memoirs.